At 7:18 on a Monday morning, construction stopped across Cedar Ridge Estates. Concrete trucks were turned around before they reached their job sites. The neighborhood's entrance fountain shut off. The irrigation system that had been keeping thousands of newly planted trees alive suddenly lost pressure. Within an hour, the HOA president was standing outside the clubhouse, pointing straight at my ranch. "He shut us down," she shouted. "He's the reason Phase 2 is dead." I hadn't shut down anything. I had simply done exactly what the HOA demanded I do. 3 weeks earlier, their attorneys ordered me to permanently remove an old underground pipeline crossing my property. According to them, it was abandoned infrastructure. It was blocking the planned realignment of an access road and utility corridor for Phase 2, and they insisted it had no legitimate purpose anymore. They didn't ask. They demanded. So I followed the law. I applied for the required county permit, hired licensed contractors, scheduled the inspections, and permanently disconnected my own pipeline. Everything was approved. Everything was documented. Everything was legal. Then, a few days later, Phase 2 began losing the water pressure it depended on. The HOA blamed me. The county started asking questions. And everyone wanted to know the same thing. How could removing one old pipeline on private property bring a multi-million-dollar development to a standstill? I didn't know the full answer when this started. Neither did the HOA. But somewhere between decades-old engineering records, forgotten easement files, and one administrative mistake nobody had caught for years, the truth had been sitting there all along. 3 months earlier, the HOA president walked onto my ranch, looked at that old pipeline, and smiled. "Once that's gone," she said, "we can finally finish Phase 2. 3 months earlier, the pipeline barely crossed my mind. A natural spring fed it year-round, and the line still supplied water to my livestock and part of the ranch during dry weather. I had inherited the property, along with enough old maintenance and easement records to know the system was active and legally documented. What I did not know was that Cedar Ridge had ever built any part of its own plans around it. For years, the neighborhood and my ranch existed side by side without much friction. Then the developer announced Phase 2, and the activity along our shared boundary changed almost immediately. Survey stakes appeared. Construction crews cleared land near the property line. Engineers began spending more time around the easement than around the new lots. At first, I assumed they were locating utilities before expanding the entrance road. Then, one afternoon, a black SUV stopped outside my gate. Melissa Carter stepped out carrying a site plan. She introduced herself, made a quick comment about the ranch, and pointed toward the eastern edge of my property. "We're adjusting the Phase 2 entrance," she said. "The revised road and utility corridor need more room along this side." Her plan showed the new alignment passing directly over the pipeline easement. "We'd like permanent access so we can relocate what's there." I studied the drawing. "Temporary construction access is one thing," I said. "Permanent rights across my property are another." She gave a small smile. "I thought that might be your answer." The conversation stayed civil, and she left a few minutes later. But after that, the HOA's interest shifted. They stopped asking mainly about access and began focusing on the pipeline itself. Survey crews measured its route more than once. Engineers photographed the easement, and temporary utility flags appeared along the line before disappearing the next day. The reason became clear when I compared their markings with the Phase 2 site plan. The pipeline sat where the developer wanted a straighter entrance road, a wider utility trench, and room for 2 additional landscaped lots near the gate. Removing it would save them from redesigning that entire section. One evening, while repairing a fence near the boundary, I heard Melissa speaking with the project manager beside a construction trailer. She pointed toward my property. "Once that line is out of the way, we can keep the road straight and avoid moving the utility corridor." The project manager looked toward the easement. "Has anyone confirmed it's abandoned?" Melissa answered quickly. "That's what the records show." I remember glancing back toward the spring. The records she had seen might have said that. The water running through the line said otherwise. The first letter arrived a week later. It was polite. The HOA explained that what they described as an abandoned agricultural pipeline conflicted with the revised Phase 2 road alignment and asked whether I'd remove it voluntarily. I wrote back that the pipeline wasn't abandoned. It remained in active use on my ranch, and I wasn't interested in removing it. A few days later, another envelope showed up. This time, it came from the HOA's attorney. The request had become a demand. The letter claimed the pipeline was interfering with an approved development and warned that refusing to cooperate could result in legal action. That was enough for me. I hired a property attorney. After reading both letters, he looked at me and said, "They can ask. They can't order you to change your own property. But from this point on, every response goes through us." So that's what we did. The HOA sent one final legal demand. My attorney replied with copies of the recorded easement, photographs showing the pipeline was still operating, and a simple statement that it remained active private infrastructure. A week later, the HOA newsletter told residents that an obsolete pipeline was delaying Phase 2 improvements. Suddenly, neighbors who had probably never noticed it before were slowing down to look at it. While preparing another response, my attorney suggested we go through every box of records my grandfather had left. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect: maintenance logs, repair receipts, survey notes. Then we found a rolled-up set of subdivision engineering drawings. We spread them across his conference table. For a minute, neither of us said much. Then he tapped a notation beside my pipeline. "Have you ever seen this before?" I leaned closer. The subdivision hadn't connected into my pipeline. Instead, the original engineering calculations assumed it would remain in service because it supplemented water pressure for several non-residential systems during the early development phases. I sat back in my chair. "I knew the pipeline was active," I said. "I just never knew they'd built part of the project expecting it to stay there." That discovery led us to another file explaining something we'd both been wondering about. Years earlier, when the subdivision was first approved, the pipeline had remained legally classified as private agricultural infrastructure because ownership never transferred from my family's ranch. The original engineers clearly understood the dependency. The permitting records, however, continued treating it as privately owned agricultural infrastructure. My attorney looked at the plans for another moment before shaking his head. No wonder everyone keeps talking past each other. The HOA thinks it's an abandoned obstacle. The county sees a privately owned farm pipeline. And these old plans tell a different story altogether. It wasn't that anyone was looking at exactly the same information and reaching different conclusions. They were looking at different records. Before responding again, my attorney attached the engineering drawings and easement documents to our formal reply, so the HOA couldn't later claim we had hidden what we'd found. When we submitted the county permit application, those same documents went with it. We specifically asked the reviewing agencies to determine whether the pipeline's continued operation affected any other approvals before acting on the application. A little over a week later, the county responded. Because the pipeline was still officially classified as privately owned agricultural infrastructure and no active registry identified it as part of a regulated utility system, the application could continue through the normal review process. My attorney read the letter twice. Then he quietly set it on his desk. I honestly thought someone would stop this for a closer look. So did I. 2 days later, the developer called asking for an emergency meeting. For the first time since the letter started, they sounded like they weren't nearly as certain anymore. The developer asked for the meeting before the county finished reviewing my permit application. That caught my attention. If they were suddenly willing to talk, something had changed. My attorney and I met them at their office the next afternoon. The mood was completely different from the legal letters. No accusations, no threats. The developer spoke first. "We'd like to resolve this before it goes any further." He slid a settlement agreement across the table. "If you'll withdraw the permit application, the HOA will withdraw every complaint and legal demand related to the pipeline." Melissa nodded. I don't think any of us expected this to become such a mess. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was a very different tone from the one we'd been receiving. I looked over at my attorney. "I'll agree to one condition." The developer leaned forward. "What is it?" "I want the HOA to acknowledge in writing that it had no legal authority to demand removal of infrastructure located entirely on my property." The room was quiet for a moment. Finally, the developer's attorney answered, "We can't do that." "Why not?" because that statement could be interpreted as admitting the HOA acted beyond its authority. If that happens, it doesn't just affect this dispute. It could trigger insurance issues, title questions, and expose both the association and the developer to additional claims. The developer rubbed his forehead. We still believe there's a good chance the county will require another review before anything is disconnected. Our engineers are also looking into whether there's another solution. In other words, they believed there was still time. If the permit stalled, or if engineering found another option, they wouldn't have to admit the HOA had overstepped its authority. My attorney closed the settlement agreement. Then we don't have a deal. No one argued. The meeting simply ended. A few days later, the county approved the permit. The approval explained that based on the official records available to the reviewing agencies, the work involved privately owned agricultural infrastructure. No additional agency objections had been filed. The permit was issued. The following week, licensed contractors arrived at the ranch. State inspectors verified the work. The pipeline was disconnected, sealed, and permanently retired. Everything was photographed. Everything was signed. Everything followed the permit exactly. When the trucks pulled away, the ranch looked no different than it had the day before. Across the fence, Phase 2 construction continued as usual. For several days, nothing obvious happened. That didn't surprise me. From my own engineering experience, systems with storage capacity don't always show a problem immediately. Reserve tanks, pressure balancing, and municipal backup can hide a change until demand gradually catches up. I suspected that if the pipeline truly wasn't serving anything important, nothing would happen at all. If it was supporting something, the answer would eventually show itself. 3 mornings later, it did. The irrigation controllers across Phase 2 began reporting pressure loss. The entrance fountain stopped running. Construction supervisors started postponing water-dependent work. And for the first time, people began asking whether that old pipeline had ever been abandoned in the first place. The first phone call came from the landscaping contractor. Several irrigation zones in Phase 2 had dropped below their minimum operating pressure. Nobody treated it as an emergency. Control systems failed from time to time, and maintenance crews started checking pumps, valves, and controllers. Nothing fixed it. By that afternoon, the entrance fountains had stopped. Construction managers reported low pressure at the temporary hydrants they used for concrete work and dust control. Inside the completed neighborhoods, homeowners still had normal municipal water service. Fire protection for occupied homes remained fully operational. The problem was isolated to the supplemental capacity that Phase 2 had been designed around. Within hours, county inspectors postponed several infrastructure inspections because water-dependent testing could no longer be completed. Concrete deliveries were rescheduled. Fresh landscaping sat waiting. The construction schedule began slipping almost immediately. Melissa insisted the timing was a coincidence. "This has to be the municipal supply," she said. The developer wasn't convinced. It started within days of the disconnection. The following morning, the engineering consultants gathered every archived project file they could find. The current engineering firm hadn't designed Cedar Ridge. They had inherited the project years after the original consultants retired and the development changed hands. Boxes that hadn't been opened in years were brought into the conference room. One engineer stopped at a memorandum attached behind the original hydraulic calculations. He read it carefully before passing it across the table. It wasn't another drawing. It was an internal instruction to future project managers stating that the private spring easement was to remain untouched until an independent replacement system had been completed and placed into service. The developer looked up. "We never received this." The lead consultant nodded. It stayed in the archived design file. "Your active project records only contain the final construction set." Melissa quietly took the document and read it herself. Then the HOA's attorney placed that memorandum beside the legal demand letters the association had sent me. The contrast was impossible to ignore. One set of records treated the pipeline as an essential temporary component of the original engineering design. The other described it as abandoned infrastructure that should be removed. The developer finally asked the question everyone had been thinking: can we reconnect it? The county engineer answered immediately: not under the existing permit. The original line has been permanently retired. Reactivating it would require a completely new engineering review, environmental approvals, and construction authorization. The option the HOA believed it had when it demanded the pipeline's removal no longer existed. Over the next 2 days, county planners, engineers, and water authorities began reviewing every approval tied to Phase 2. Contractors wanted revised schedules. Lenders started asking for updates. Homeowners wanted to know why construction had suddenly slowed. Late Friday afternoon, a county planner uncovered one final document that hadn't been included in the permit review. It wasn't another engineering drawing. It was part of the original Phase 2 approval package. He placed it on the conference table and asked everyone to read one highlighted paragraph. By the expressions around the room, it was clear that paragraph was about to decide the future of the entire project. The county scheduled a formal infrastructure review the following Tuesday. By then, the dispute had grown well beyond the HOA. Representatives from the planning department, county engineering office, water authority, the developer, the HOA, and both legal teams filled the conference room. My attorney and I sat quietly near the back. Nobody was there to argue anymore. Everyone wanted the same answer. How had a lawfully approved permit brought Phase 2 to a standstill? The county's chief engineer began by projecting 3 documents onto the screen. The answer is here, he said. The first was the original Phase 2 approval package. One condition stood out immediately. Until an independent replacement system was completed and certified, the development had to maintain the supplemental water capacity identified in the original engineering design. The second document was the engineering memorandum the current project team had only recently found in the archived files. It warned future project managers not to disturb the private spring easement until that replacement system was operating. Finally, the county displayed the HOA's legal demand letters. Those letters repeatedly described the pipeline as abandoned infrastructure, even after my attorney had responded with proof that it was active and submitted the recorded easement. The county engineer looked around the room. These documents don't tell the same story. They reflect different records, and, in one case, an assumption that turned out to be incorrect. He then explained why the permit had still been approved. The pipeline remained listed in the active registry as privately owned agricultural infrastructure. The original operational dependency existed only in archived engineering files that had never been transferred into the current infrastructure records used during permit review. The county attorney picked up from there. The HOA demanded removal of privately owned infrastructure. The owner responded through legal counsel. He disclosed the pipeline was active, provided the engineering documents in his possession, and sought government approval before taking any action. The permit process relied on the official records available at the time. He paused. That administrative failure explains how the permit was issued. He looked toward the HOA board. It does not change the fact that the association continued demanding removal after being informed the pipeline was active and privately owned. That distinction mattered. The record management failure explained how the permit moved forward. The HOA's decisions explained why the dispute existed in the first place. The planning director opened the county's final report. Because the original approval required supplemental capacity until a replacement system was operational, Phase 2 construction cannot continue under its current approvals. The developer must design, construct, and certify an independent replacement system before work resumes. The developer nodded slowly. There wasn't really another option. Then came the question everyone expected. Who pays for it? The county attorney answered without hesitation. The developer remains responsible for satisfying the conditions attached to the subdivision approval. He then turned toward Melissa and the HOA's counsel. The association's potential liability is separate and relates to its unauthorized legal demands and any damages arising from those actions. Outside the county building, local reporters were already covering the construction shutdowns and Phase 2 water pressure problems that had delayed the project for nearly a week. By the end of the afternoon, the story had changed. It wasn't about a ranch owner stopping a development. It was about an old engineering condition that disappeared from active records, and an HOA that kept insisting a functioning pipeline was abandoned even after being shown otherwise. As we walked out of the meeting, I glanced back into the conference room. The 3 documents were still lying on the table. Separately, none of them told the whole story. Together, they explained exactly how the project had reached this point. Construction stayed frozen while the developer's engineers went back to the drawing board. The county's position was straightforward. Phase 2 could move forward, but only after the development met the same approval condition that had been there from the beginning. This time, it would do so with a completely independent water system. Over the next several months, engineers redesigned that portion of the subdivision. The revised plans included new transmission lines, a dedicated storage tank, booster equipment, and a standalone system that no longer depended on anything outside Cedar Ridge's boundaries. It wasn't a redesign the current developer had expected to build. It was the infrastructure the original development approval had always anticipated would eventually replace the temporary supplemental system. The cost ran into the millions. Under the subdivision agreements, the developer remained responsible for delivering infrastructure that satisfied the county's approval conditions. That obligation hadn't changed simply because ownership and engineering teams had changed over the years. The HOA faced a different set of consequences. Its legal demands had started a dispute over property it never had authority to control. Insurance investigators spent weeks reviewing board minutes, legal opinions, and correspondence to determine which costs resulted from ordinary governance and which resulted from actions taken outside the association's authority. Some claims were covered, others were not. The association ultimately absorbed substantial legal expenses that had nothing to do with building roads or water systems. Melissa resigned before the HOA's annual election. There wasn't much discussion about it. Most residents were focused on when construction would restart, not who occupied the president's chair. The more significant changes happened outside the HOA. The county updated its review procedures so archived engineering conditions affecting private easements had to be reconciled with active infrastructure records before permits could be approved. It wasn't a dramatic policy, just a practical one. A few weeks later, my attorney called. The county recorded the final easement documents. I drove into town and signed the last of the paperwork. The original pipeline remained permanently retired. Its purpose had been fulfilled years earlier. The replacement system was now doing exactly what it had always been intended to do. The easement itself, however, was now clearer than it had ever been. Future developers, property owners, engineers, and public agencies would all be working from the same record. No missing notes, no forgotten files sitting in an archive. On my way home, I drove past Cedar Ridge. Construction crews were back. The fountains were running again. This time, the subdivision was operating on infrastructure that belonged entirely to the subdivision. I kept driving. Looking back, the pipeline was never really the problem. It simply exposed a problem that had been buried in the paperwork for years. Every now and then, someone asks whether I regret disconnecting the pipeline. Honestly, I don't regret following the legal process, but I do wish the right records had reached the right people before it ever came to that. When my attorney and I found the old engineering plans, we knew the pipeline mattered. That's why we included those documents with our responses and the permit application. I expected the additional information to trigger a closer review. I thought someone would stop the process, compare the records, and sort out the contradiction before anything happened. Instead, each office reviewed the information available to it, and the permit moved forward. By the time everyone finally assembled the complete picture, the pipeline had already been retired. The developer eventually built the independent water system the original approval had always anticipated. The county strengthened its review process. And my family's easement records were finally as clear as they should have been years earlier. Looking back, one lesson has stayed with me. Authority is important, but it should never move faster than verification, especially when someone has already handed you evidence that challenges what you think you know. So I'm curious, if you had been in my position, would you have kept trying to convince the HOA to back down? Or would you have submitted everything through the legal process and accepted whatever the official review decided? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy stories where preparation, patience, and good documentation matter just as much as standing your ground, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.